Good evening and welcome to Boleskine Talks. My name is Stuart Cleland. I'm a trustee at the Boleskine House Foundation. We are a Scottish registered charity who look to preserve and restore the legacy and history of Boleskine House. Over the next few months, we're going to be hosting a number of visiting scholars and academics to discuss and explore the topic of Western esotericism. Our guest tonight, I'm very pleased to say, has done an excellent job online in making this material more accessible in a scholarly and academic manner. It gives me much pleasure to welcome Dr. Justin Sledge. Justin, thank you for coming along and speaking to us this evening.
Absolutely. Thank you, Stuart, and all the folks at Boleskine who are doing all the incredible work there to preserve this important piece of heritage. So it's really an honor to be here and to talk a little about a long-standing interest I've had in Dr. John Dee.
Thank you. If we just dive in with a few questions before your presentation, can you
Mhm.
tell us a bit about your background and what got you started in this field of study?
So a big part of it was Dr. John Dee and specifically the strange so-called Enochian language, the angelic language, the Adamical language, ever how you want to frame it. I remember being a teenager learning Latin and seeing that this strange language revealed to Edward Kelly had all of the structure of a language. It had grammar and vocabulary. It wasn't the glossolalia that I had heard at, when my friends would drag me to the Pentecostal churches. And when I was able to see that was intriguing to me because if it were non-stochastic, if it were non-random in the same way that glossolalia is somewhat stochastic, well, that's weird. That's very weird. And a lot of the attendant mysteries that surrounded that material fired my imagination for many years. And once I finished undergraduate, where I graduated with a degree in philosophy and religion, there was just a kind of itch that I had never been able to scratch. And I was like, all right, well, I'm going to scratch the itch now, and applied to go to Amsterdam to study under Koku van Stuckrad and Wouter Hanegraaff and other people. And I spent basically my entire time there working on John Dee material, the Mons Hieroglyphica, which I'll talk a little bit about today, but also the Spirit Diaries. So yeah, that was a big interest, and I've never totally shook it. And John Dee remains a character, and that I remain interested in.
Could you give some advice to anybody here who might be looking to start an academic study of Western esotericism? Where would they begin and how would they manage to get their foot in the door?
I mean, this is where I maybe mentioned something I've created recently. I created a spreadsheet, which I can put in the chat at some point in a minute. But basically, it's a spreadsheet sort of grouping Western esotericism by books, all which are academic titles, all of which are to some degree accessible. So you won't see a lot of titles by Brill and other kinds of academic publishers who charge, frankly, extortionate prices for their books. But basically, I go through and say, like, these are the books, top 5 books, if you wanted to have on your shelf for Gnosticism, Hermeticism, for Renaissance magic, for whatever. And it sort of goes through and groups them that way. And it's sort of the ones, if I were rebuilding my library from scratch, God forbid, something happened to it, and I had to have those books on the shelf, it's sort of the way I would do it. And it's all anchored in Wouter Hanegraaff's Western Esotericism, A Guide to the Perplexed, which is, in my opinion, the most accessible, most comprehensive. The book is worth the bibliography alone. And last summer, Wouter said he's going to come out with another edition of it. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what that looks like. But that would be where I would start if you're looking at an academic inroad into the field. Um, but yeah, I also have lots of episodes on my channel where I try to group them by playlists where, just because you're interested in Gnosticism doesn't mean you're interested in Renaissance magic, although there tends to be comorbidity among interest in Western esotericism broadly. That's also a place to start. And I usually have, at the end of any episode, I have some layout of the scholarly field where folks can get access to secondary and literature.
This is a question I'm hoping to ask every scholar that we have on in the next few months, and it's perhaps a bit unfair, but do you think you could define what esotericism is?
Nah, no. Um, Not in any rigorous way. Look, categories are sometimes helpful and always wrong. They're sometimes useful, but they're never true. And so it's really important to say that when we talk about categories like Western esotericism, and this is where I come at this from a philosophical angle. I'm trained as a philosopher. I'm not trained as a historian or a religious studies person. I'm one of the weird people in this field that comes at this from a largely philosophical angle. I just don't think categories are that important. I think that they're you move resolution, you get higher resolution, and higher resolution categories capture less and less. Lower resolution categories capture more and more, and they're at some point they become trivial. So, all of these different categorizations are useful, whether it's Valter's of its rejected knowledge, but that also has problems with the resolution. For instance, mysticism is lost in that categorization. Kabbalah is lost in that categorization, which strikes me as extremely strange. Astrology, at some level, would be lost by that categorization. But on the other hand, author Vaslusa's phenomenological approach also has its own limitations as well. So I think that the question about esotericism, when I go at it, is I have a very heuristic way of approaching it. Is it esoteric in that discourse at that time in this way? Is it esoteric because we've gone back in time and imposed that categorization onto that thing in a way that they wouldn't have thought of what they were doing as esoteric? Um, I think it all depends, and I think that a lot of what a lot of what makes a good science paper good is also what makes a good paper good, and that's the methodology section of your paper. And I feel like when I'm seeing a new book or a new thing on esotericism simplicator, I get really nervous until I get a hold of their methodology section. Then I'm like, okay, I have some sense of what's going on here. So no, I don't think there's any sort of a priori definition of it, just because the term itself is like parasitic on the concept of there being things that are exoteric. And is scholasticism exoteric? I mean, have you read Duns Scotus? Is that in any way like exoteric in the 13th century? I don't even know what that means to talk about that text as being um, exoteric in a way that Pseudo-Dionysius, which we would put as an esoteric text, was much more widely read and appreciated. So these categories are, again, these categories can be helpful, but I think that they actually exhaust their helpfulness if you do more than just like keep it cranked long enough. The engine misfires very quickly for most of these categories. So I think that the answer is we shouldn't be looking for some a priori definition of esotericism. We should be getting as granular as we can so that that category is useful, because it's never going to be true.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Well, with much further ado, if I could ask you just to take over and talk to us, please, about John Dee.
Yeah, let's talk a bit about John Dee. I feel bad, the person last week was talking about specifically Hermeticism in Scotland, which was a fantastic talk. I feel bad that I'm not also anchored more in the terroir of the region, but you'll forgive me that I'm dealing with an Englishman, although of Welsh origins. Um, so the attention that often gets put on John Dee, I often find to be a little bit either you can't see the trees for the forest or you can't see the forest for the trees when you think about dealing with the life and works of John Dee, especially if you think about those from a philosophical point of view. And what I mean by that is either he's sort of stuck in the history of science box, right? And that's sort of where he gets stuck, or he's stuck in the occultism box, and that's sort of where he gets stuck. And I think in many of those places, you get this kind of funhouse mirror version of John Dee. And in a particular case, I'm looking at him primarily here in the point of view of his relationship in the history of philosophy and the history of semiotics. I'll say more about what I mean by semiotics in just a moment. But what I mean here, I guess, is to say this. Most philosophers, and I say philosophers, I mean people who do the history of philosophy, don't care about John Dee. They're not going to read anything John Dee wrote because it's of no philosophical interest for them, because they have a certain kind of story they tell about the history of how philosophy developed. Specifically, scholasticism happened, then, you wave your hands and say something bad about Renaissance philosophy, and then you jump over to Descartes, and now we're in modernity and rationalism, and everyone feels safe again. that's kind of the way history of philosophy deals in many ways with these Renaissance and early modern, what we might call occult philosophers, for lack of a better term. Um, Occultists, on the other hand, tend to hyper focus on John Dee, and they tend to not see the context. They see this angelic language business. They see this bizarre text or the Monas Hieroglyphica of 1564, and because of that hyper focus, they don't realize that John Dee and his thinking have a context. So either we get Dee out of context, or we get context and no John Dee. And I feel like this is true of Cornelius Agrippa. This is true of Pico to a lesser degree. Although that's a great example with Pico, how again we read the oration on the dignity of man and then conveniently leave off all the sections about magic at the end, because those make philosophers uncomfortable. And God forbid any philosopher be made to feel uncomfortable about thinking hard about things in history. But this is a kind of weird thing that I see going on with what I might call occult philosophers or philosophy of the occult, is either it's incredibly narrowly focused, right, or it's not focused at all, and all you get is the context. What I want to do is try to do a little bit of work situating John Dee specifically in a specific context, and that is the context of the intersection of semiotics and metaphysics. So why semiotics and metaphysics? I think the metaphysics should be pretty interesting. I mean, the guy was interested in radical truths, and he was interested in those radical truths insofar as he could speak to angels via a scryer or medium in order to achieve them. I don't know about you, but there's a lot of metaphysical suppositions and presuppositions going into the idea that you can talk to angels to get radical truths about the nature of reality, about the nature of physics, about the end of the world, about politics for that matter. So clearly, this is all bound up in pretty significant metaphysical claims about the nature of reality. And again, I would say this is true of the Monas Hieroglyphica as well. As we'll see in a minute, the Monas Hieroglyphica makes very, very radical metaphysical claims, specifically about the power of the hieroglyphic monad. In fact, the Monas Hieroglyphica is knee-deep in a kind of Neo-Pythagoreanism. So not only is it making metaphysical claims, it's making metaphysical claims that have a very firm foundation in the history of philosophy, specifically in a kind of Kabbalistically infused Neo-Pythagoreanism. And of course, the conversation with the angels, that's nothing less than straightforward apocalyptic religiosity. If it is the case that what the angels were telling Dee and Kelly was about to happen, that in some sense the conversations themselves were the heralds of the very finality of all things. And so obviously metaphysics is on the agenda in a big way all through Dee's life, whether it is in his like sort of esoteric astrological work at the very beginning of his life, through the Monas Hieroglyphica, all the way through the angelic diaries, and there all the way toward the end, as he's even doing things like challenging the James I to put him on trial for sorcery. Not a great idea. Semiotics. I think most folks have some sense of what metaphysics is. Semiotics is a bit of a more obscure branch of philosophy. Classically, semiotics has to do with the study of representation. That is to say, how do signs work? How does representation work? What does it mean to know that the color red means stop? What does it mean to know that certain shapes denote certain kinds of things? This is a classic field developed primarily by Ferdinand de Saussure in the late 19th and early 20th century. But in the development of semiotics, one of the core ideas that underwrites all of contemporary semiotics is that the relationship of sign and signifier are arbitrary, which is just a complicated way of saying that there is an infinite, potentially all arbitrary means by which to engage a representation. There's no reason why the word dog should be dog. It could be canis, it could be kelev, it could be shin, it could be och, it could be any of those words in Latin and Mayan and Hebrew. And all of those words, as long as you know the different languages that I'm speaking, as long as you know those languages, the process of representation works. There's no one language where canis, representing dog, is doing any better job of representing dog than any other language is doing. So that relationship in modern contemporary semiotics is arbitrary. Now, for all my folks in here, obviously, you all will know that is completely anything other than the truth in pre-modern semiotics. In pre-modern semiotics, the relationship of sign and signifier is not arbitrary, it's often divinely mandated. That is to say, God's self, has knit the world together such that representation is non-arbitrary. That if you have the image of the sun, and you have a plant that is solar in nature, and it is operating in a certain kind of relationship, you can capture that relationship in a talisman, and that talismanic power can bear out force upon nature. So the system of representations, the mandrake root and the human body are connected through a system of representations, through the system of signatures, to use the language of someone like Paracelsus, although there's lots of variations of this. Paracelsus is just one of those. And of course, language as a mode of representation is anything other than arbitrary at this time period, which is to say that for most people at this time, at least Hebrew had some kind of ontological, some kind of metaphysical connection to the creation of the world in the form of divine speech. That'll be complicated by John Dee, as we'll see in a minute. And of course, you're looking at some sections here from the Liber Loga, from the angelical speech, and you'll know obviously that John Dee and the angels. And again, when I say angels here, I'm just going with what the text says. I'm not committing myself to the belief that there were or there weren't angels. I'm not asking you to do either one as well, but the text says that angels were talking to Kelly, and I'm going to go with that. Now I'm going to bracket my own potential biases about what I believe may have been going on with there. So there's a lot of different ways we could come at this. There's a lot of different ways we could come at this problem. I came at it in a very particular way, and when I worked on the Monis Hieroglyphica, but what I want to come at it today is I want to come at it from the what is called the problem of universals. So the problem of universals is, like all philosophical problems, it's a problem that goes back to Plato and Aristotle. We can blame basically Plato and Aristotle for basically all Western philosophical problems. And if you really want to kick the can back a little more, you can blame them all on Parmenides and Heraclitus. But the problem of universals has to do with the issue of categories. When I say that Socrates is a human, I have a pretty clear idea that Socrates exists, right? Even if he's dead currently. But I know I have a good sense of, like, when I say Justin is a human, well, you got a pretty good sense of who I am and what I am, and there's some metaphysical and physical currency about identifying me. Human is a weirder thing, because human is a metaphysical category that it's hard to find where and exactly in reality it exists. And famously, there were two answers to the problem of universals. You probably all know the Platonic answer. The Platonic answer was universals are real. They are ontological, metaphysical categories that, insofar as I am being a human being, I am participating, to use the language of Plato, in the form of humanity, and that is what is instantiating my humanity. So Justin, individual Justin, is participating in the form of humanity, and that instantiates my humanity as such. You're doing the same thing currently as well. We are all participating in the form of humanity. And the form of humanity is real, it is eternal, it is perfect, and it is unchanging. It exists in the realm of the forms, in the realm of being. We exist in the realm of becoming. I will one day die. I will no longer be a human being, and I will pass out into the world of becoming. But hopefully, my soul, according to Plato, will pass on. The answer given by Aristotle, right? I'll come back to this in just a second. The answer given by Aristotle is that no, the forms are ridiculous. Is there a form of water and a form of dirt? Well, if you put water and dirt together, you get mud. Is there a form of mud? Is there a form of, famously Parmenides, is there a form of hair and dirt and mud? And Aristotle rejected the concept of forms. And basically what he says is that we have a system of correct names, and those correct names are just linguistic units. And whether something exists in those categories are just about whether those propositions actually work together by logic. And logic is just a way of manipulating propositions so as to know who belongs in what category, right? And that's basically what, in many ways, the Aristotelian logic is. It's a categorical logic about figuring out where things belong in certain categories. But the categories are abstract linguistic conventions. They are not real in a metaphysical sense. Secondly, it's the second issue that we're going to deal with, and they're connected. Does the language that we use have an impact on the way that we do that categorization? That is to say, can we categorize better or worse from a metaphysical point of view in different languages? Which is to say, do some languages have logical and creative power? Another way of putting that is, do some languages have divine power? Do some languages have theurgical power? Which is to say, not only can they do the work of categorizing things, but they can do the work of changing those categories or changing the nature of the things in those categories. Now, that's where language has metaphysical effect on reality, right? That's a much more powerful question. Now, Plato and Aristotle both typically answered that in the negative. Aristotle really was a conventionalist. He really said, no, language is just a convention by which we name things and we stick stuff in linguistically appropriate categories. Plato was a little different here. He thought that maybe language had its origins in natural signs, specifically in the principle of onomatopoeia. That is to say that the language that we develop language out of, and this is a discussion in the Cratylus, that we develop language out of basically mimicking nature, and that language itself has its origin in natural signs. Now, does that mean that you get to shape nature by understanding those natural signs? No, the logical relationship goes one way, not two ways. But as we'll see when we get to things like theurgical practices and other kinds of practices in people like Iamblichus, the belief is that that is a two-way, or at least potentially a two-way street. At any rate, the problem of universals, we've been caught in this problem for quite some time. And I would suggest that basically every answer ever given is somewhere on the Platonic to Aristotelian spectrum. Either the categories are real or they are conventional. And that's where things have landed for the basically all of Western civilization, Western philosophy. Now, what you would be surprised to learn is that in early medieval philosophy, the solution to the problem of universals was initially, at least in Western European philosophy, largely answered Platonically, which is to say, the early Latin philosophers in the West, people like Pseudo-Dionysius and John Scotus of Regina, they tended to be Platonists, right? And they gave a largely Platonic answer to the problem of universals. Specifically, they engaged in what is called moderate realism. Moderate realism is, yes, the categories exist, but they exist in the mind of God. So what happens is God is always thinking about humanity, and insofar as God is always thinking about humanity, that allows me to instantiate my humanity as such. So it's not in some abstract realm like it is in Plato. They are thoughts in the mind of God, right? So that's the sort of moderated, one of the moderated versions of how this is going to exist in the very early Latin West. After Boethius, there was a reaction against that, largely coming on the heels of people like Abelard and the translations of Aristotle and Averroes coming in from Spain. And what ultimately ends up happening is between Abelard and Occam, and this is very much summarizing, so you'll forgive me, between the dual vice grips of Abelard and Occam, nominalism crushed realism, which is to say the realist position that the categories are real, the metaphysical categories are real, was systematically taken apart over the course of about 200 years. And by Occam in the 14th century, you'll probably know Occam from his famous razor, ultimately nominalism, the idea that the categories were mere names, had become the dominant position among academics. The dominant position among academics. Now, of course, does that mean that it was dominant among anyone else? Probably not, because no one cared what a bunch of guys in Paris were thinking, but that's at least where the intellectual environment was, at least at the university level. Now, there were moderated versions of these, right? There's moderated versions between realism and nominalism. I'll give an example of, for instance, Duns Scotus. Scotus accepted a moderated version, an even more moderated version of realism. For instance, he believed that the categories did exist, but they existed in everyone's individual minds. They didn't exist in the mind of God like they did for John Scotus of Regina or Pseudo-Dionysius or someone like Philo of Alexandria. They existed in our mind, and it was because God had created our minds in a certain kind of way, that God had given us the good grace that all of our minds work the same way. You can tell this to all the neurodivergent folks who will disagree with you. But according to this idea, God made our minds work the same way by God's grace, and that is the reason why we're able to have logical discussions. It's not because logic is real out there. It's because God and God's grace has made all of our minds work the same way. It's kind of a harmony of categories, but they're not real outside of our mind, but rather they are functioning inside the mind, and that is how we do all the work of categorizing things. And that won the day. Occam carried the day, right? Occam carried the day, with one exception, right? That is to say, at the University of Cologne, there, Albertism held the day. For folks who are studying along with me in my class on Cornelius Agrippa, you'll know that that's a real big part of how Cornelius Agrippa gets his way into the early occult philosophy, is because at the University of Cologne, where he's matriculated, Albertism, which has a pretty strong connection to esotericism and occultism, magic, natural magic, that carried the day more in Cologne, but everywhere else, nominalism had carried the day until it didn't. What changed? What changed was the conquest of Constantinople. And once Constantinople was captured, a wave of refugees began to make their way into Italy, and they bring with them the plague that is Plato. And I'm kidding. I got to be careful when I say things like that. It's an easy way to get stoned in these parts. Plato is brought over along with Neoplatonism, whatever that is, Plotinus, Iamblichus, Proclus, and all those guys, Damascus, and the Corpus Hermeticum is brought over. And so, at the feet of Ficino, as I'm sure everyone here knows, what ends up happening is that all of this literature is being translated and reintroduced into the Latin West in some sense for the first time. You'll recall, for instance, that the only thing really we had of Plato up until this point was the Timaeus, right? That's basically the only major text of Plato that we had. We had the Timaeus, and that was kind of it. And even the stuff we had from Aristotle was often confused. We had things that, like the theology of Aristotle, that was actually a bunch of Plotinus mixed with other stuff. Or we had the meteorology of Aristotle that had a random section of Ibn Sina at the end. It was a confused history of bringing these texts to life. What ends up happening at this point in beginning in the late 15th century, or 15th century in general, is that a hand grenade is thrown into the ruin of nominalism. And all of a sudden, realism, which had been basically defeated in the Latin West, comes roaring into existence in the form of Platonism, in the form of Neoplatonism, in the form of things like the Corpus Hermeticum. And so this really causes a watershed moment where an entire world of intellectuals who are awash in this new literature, people like Ficino, people like Pico della Mirandola, people like Agrippa, and eventually Dee, as we'll see, they're now looking at the nominalists, the scholastics, and saying, no, we don't buy this anymore. We never bought it. We're not accepting this nominalist vision of the world. We're not buying this. And we have a wholly different way of thinking about this problem now. And this other way of solving this problem might give us access to other technologies, specifically mystical, spiritual, magical technologies that nominalism simply can't do. Simply can't do for all kinds of reasons that should be more or less obvious. Now, how do they vouchsafe all this? Well, folks will know here, right, that in the Renaissance, the going theory of the time was the Prisca Theologia. That is to say, the earlier something was, the more true it was, and antiquity, in some sense, vouchsafe the veracity of this material. And that's in some sense why you never really see Ficino or Bruno more so, but Ficino or Pico, you never see them really get into like debates with the scholastics. Now, Ficino was happy to debate his positions, but you never see Agrippa do anything other than just disdain the scholastics. And there's a simple reason for this. The reason for this is because they didn't care. The scholastics represented a I don't know what's the right word, a corrupted, moribund philosophy that ultimately had no truth value, because we could go all the way back to this ancient stuff, and this ancient material was true because it was more ancient in some sense. We didn't need to argue with Duns Scotus. Duns Scotus just did a bunch of logic chopping and made a bunch of stuff up. He didn't even have access to this material that Hermes Trismegistus had, in which he had taught Moses. Does Duns Scotus know better than Hermes Trismegistus? Of course he doesn't. So you could just dispense with it. Right? And this is where you get the idea that the Dunsmen, the followers of Duns Scotus, become dunces. And that's where the dunce hats come from. It's making fun of these people for this, where the term Gothic comes from. Oh, that's just Gothic nonsense. where the term Gothic becomes a term of negativity. So this, along with humanism and stuff that's arising, is now beginning to formulate into a kind of de facto anti-scholasticism and a revanchist, if I could say, revanchist kind of realism. Now, that's the Christians. The Jews are back in the corner, raising their hand, being like, "Hey guys, we never did nominalism. That was never our thing. We've not been on that train at all, ever. Just so you know, we've held a theory since basically the days of the Talmud and the Sefer Yetzirah that language is inherently powerful. At least Hebrew language is inherently powerful. Why? Because that's how God spoke being into the creation. And therefore, the relationship between Hebrew and reality is anything other than just names. It's anything other than arbitrary. There is a mystical connection between reality, Torah, and God. And so realism had never been lost in the Kabbalah. It had never been lost. In fact, by the writing of the Sefer Zohar and other texts that have given rise to the Kabbalah as we know it, realism got ramped up. So much so that during groups like the Chassidei Ashkenaz, you had an intense magical practice linked to using Hebrew as a tool, as a theurgical tool. And so this was never ever lost it was never lost, or it had never experienced a jump to realism in the world of Kabbalah and Jewish theology. And then we begin to get the trifecta of all this, right? What I might call the Hermetic onslaught. Three things come together to empower an entire new generation of thinkers. The first is what I will call Neo-Platonism, which is to say all of the Platonism that comes after Plato. And that is going to be imbued with Platonic ideas, which is to say the hardcore realism of Plato. It's going to be infused with Kabbalistic ideas coming out of the world of Giovanni Pico della Mirandola and his massive translation projects that are going on with people like Yochanan Alameno and Flavius Mithridates, but later Paulus Rhesius and all those cats that are translating all of the Kabbalistic material for the Christians for the first time. And then finally, the Hermetic tradition, the Hermeticism that is emerging and will be taken on by people like Ludovico Lazzarelli and really turned into a kind of new form of Christianity, where it is a reformed Christianity along Hermetic Kabbalistic lines, a la someone like Reuchlin. And you can begin to see this happening with these thinkers. Pico makes the shift to what a kind of neo-Pythagorean conception of number, what he refers to as formal number. And he calls this is not the number of the merchants. If you've ever read John Dee's Monas Hieroglyphica, or if you've read Cornelius Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy, that language of formal number not being the number of the merchants, that exact phrase is repeated by all three of them. They're all using that language. They get it from Pico, but it's flowing. It's actually in the Oration on the Dignity of Man, and I think it's in the 900 Theses. Ficino is also beginning to think about the world completely differently than the scholastic worldview. As you probably know, in the scholastic world, right, you have the sublunar world ruled by rectilinear motion, and then you have the superlunar world governed by circular motion. And there's no punching through, right, the sublunar world into the world of the spheres, because that's governed by an Aristotelian conception of how reality is structured. Ficino just rejects that and says, nope, we're going great chain of being. It's all connected. And not only is it all connected, I can access powerful elements within the heavenly system, and I can use those elements to engage in magic. He was a bit guarded in how he went about doing that, but Ficinian magic relies on a totally different worldview than the scholastic worldview, relies on a great chain of being model, and that is deeply infused by Hermeticism and Neoplatonism, all of which he's doing the work of translating. So Reuchlin marries some of this stuff together with Kabbalah and develops a theory of theurgy, totally cooked in with the idea of using the divine name in Hebrew, Yod He Vav He, with a correction, putting the shin, Yod He, Shin Vav He, spelling out Yeshua, the name Jesus. And he thinks that by this miracle, by this special name, one can work all kinds of profound miracles. And that is all spelled out in his famous book, De Verbo Mirifico. And of course, Agrippa would synthesize all of this into the great Summa that would become the 1510 juvenile draft of the three books of occult philosophy, and then, of course, become the three books of occult philosophy in the publication of 1533, where you get all of it. You get Platonism, you get Hermeticism, and you get Kabbalah, especially there in book 3 of the three books of occult philosophy. Within 100 years of all of this going down, we began to see John Dee appear on the screen. And Dee is going to be infused with all of this. He begins purchasing books of Kabbalah as early as his first trip to Paris. He's already picking up a great deal of Hermetic ideas in his travels and teachings. And he is obviously interested in the practice of magic. He has one of the greatest collections of magical textbooks in Europe, aside from the library there that was formerly owned by Trithemius. He has access to all of this, and he makes use of all of this, right? Something like the Liber Iuratus. He directly relied on that magical manual that he had at least two copies of, in his library. That's going to underwrite ultimately things like the sigil of truth. I want to argue in the brief time that I have left, just to check the time to make sure I'm not going too terribly far over, that Dee represents the most radical of all of the realists. That Dee is in some sense the most radical of these realists. Specifically, I want to argue that it's in the context of the Monis Hieroglyphica and in the context of the angel diaries and the angel conversations that Dee puts this really to the limits, I think, of what is even possible or credulous. As I mentioned, Dee has already made contact with some of the most prominent Christian Kabbalists, folks like Guillaume Postel, as early as 1564, the same year he publishes the Monis Hieroglyphica. He has some Hebrew, although his Hebrew is never terribly good, I don't think. But even at this early time, he had actually rejected the idea that Hebrew was the fundamental ontological language. There was a whole quest at this time for what was called the lingua adamica, the Adamical language, by which one could recover that prelapsarian power that Adam himself had over nature. And the going theory at that time, of course, was that language was Hebrew. Dee ultimately rejected that. And what he's going to shift is to the idea, and the idea already found in Ficino, that the most powerful forms of representation are going to be non-linguistic. They're going to be symbolic in some sense. And that symbolic representation is going to be what he's going to unfurl in the Monis Hieroglyphica. Stuart, am I getting close to time? Good. Okay. Just let me know when I've gone on too long, and I'll speed things up. The Monis Hieroglyphica, folks, as you probably know, is Dee's attempt to basically systematize all of representation, especially ontological representation, into one discrete symbol that will capture the truths of physics, of astronomy, of alchemy, of magic, of mathematics, and of language. What he attempted to do in the 1564 Monis Hieroglyphica, which he wrote over the course of just about, I think, 7 days or something, 12 days in January of 1564, although he said he'd been pregnant with it for 7 years, was try to spell out over the course of 24 mere theorems a single symbol to rule them all. And through its manipulation, one could not only understand all of reality, physics, metaphysics, all of it, but one could manipulate reality through the use of the symbol. Because for Dee, semiotics, representation, and ontology were not just connected, but when they were done in their most pure way, they were collapsed. That representation and being were identical. And that manipulating one, manipulated the other, and that manipulating the other in the correct way manipulated the other as well. It was a bridge between representation or symbology and metaphysics. And if that sounds bizarre, Dee admits it. He says, look, all the other Kabbalists out there are just doing the Kabbalah of what is said. I'm doing the Kabbalah of the real. And he calls it as much in the introduction to the Monis Hieroglyphica. So much so that he thinks by manipulating the Monis Hieroglyphica, by decomposing it into its various parts, and then recomposing it in its various parts, you can, 1, discover the secrets of nature, and 2, you could manipulate reality without having to get your hands all dirty, mucking about, manipulating the world in a way that would cause you to, as we'll see, get cold by standing outside looking at stars or something like this. What he wants to do is show that such stuffness, quiddity, could be extracted from formal existence. And there is no more pure formal existence than symbols. Symbols are the most pure form of existence, especially symbols inside your mind. They are the most pure formal existence imaginable. When you write out the number 4, the symbol of the number 4 that you write out, that's just a written version of the pure symbol that you're imagining. And that imaginary number 4 is just a representation of the eternal number 4 that exists at the metaphysical register. Dee thinks the Monas Hieroglyphica captures all of those at once. Now, how does he do that? He's going to say that this kind of manipulation is actually more real. The formal manipulation of the symbol is somehow more real than actually going out and mucking about doing experiments. This is perhaps the most extreme example that he gives in Theorem 22. Dee, and this, again, this is a little, you can see this little bleed through this image or whatever, but what you're seeing here is a alchemical lab made up of the various elements of the Monas Hieroglyphica. You can see little distillation apparatus. You can see you can see like a little, like a little furnace here. You can see all of these elements made up of the Monas Hieroglyphica. And Dee even tells us, why would you waste your time doing actual alchemy or standing out in the cold looking at stars when you can just do this? Because all truths, right, whether they're astronomy in the sky or alchemy, what he calls astronomia inferior, why do any of this when you can merely do it Kabbalistically, merely by manipulating the forms of the Monas Hieroglyphica to reveal the exact same truths? He does the same thing with language. He extracts the word El, God, although written in English letters or Latin letters, from the Monas Hieroglyphica. What I want to argue is that Dee is part of this hardcore realist revolution, and he pushes it as far as one can. So much so that the distinction between symbol and reality becomes collapsed. That metaphysics and semiotics are collapsed in Dee's thinking in the Monas Hieroglyphica. Now, I don't know, again, you get the sense that Dee sort of wrote this out in kind of a fevered pitch. And I think he's going to walk this back a bit. But as I mentioned, he doesn't walk it back very much. Because as soon as the 1564 Monas Hieroglyphica is done, he's still out there looking for these radical truths. I think the Monas Hieroglyphica did not give him what he wanted. Otherwise, I think that he would not have eventually turned to the conversation with angels. But notice, folks, what he's obsessed with as soon as they even engage with the conversations with angels. The very first thing that Dee asks the angels about is the Book of Soiga. This is a book composed largely of grids, of letters. If you're a fan of Enochian magic, you know what's coming now. It's a lot of grids and letters and numbers. But the Book of Soiga was the first thing that he asked, I think, the angel Michael about. And he asked, "What did Adam have this book in paradise?" And sure enough, the angel says, yes, he had it in paradise. So already out of the gate, Dee is still interested in this idea that there's some kind of pre-lapsarian linguistic structure, some kind of a linguistic artifact that'll get us back to that pre-Adamical state, whether it's the Book of Soiga, which we now know since the 1990s was generated through an algorithm. Jim Reed was able to crack the Book of Soiga, which also, by the way, tells us that John Dee wasn't the biggest, baddest mathematician that we think of him often. We think of him as being the best mathematician in the world. The algorithm that generated the Book of Soiga is not terribly complicated. All things told, it's a very simple algorithm. At any rate, what ends up happening in the spirit diaries, so I don't have to belabor this, is that Dee, and I think Kelly knew this at some level, Dee becomes radically interested in this business of the Adamical language. That becomes the linchpin issue, whether it's in the form of the Liber Loga, which is this sort of apocalyptic text that the unlocking of which through the 19 psalm-like texts that we all know of in the Enochian language. All of that linguistic business, which occupies a huge footprint in the actual spirit diaries, is still to be located philosophically within the context of this business about the relationship of semiotics and metaphysics. So you'll see there on the right, that's some examples of the actual Enochian script written out by Edward Kelly. We rarely ever see this for whatever reason, but I like to actually see it written out the way that it would have appeared to Dee and Kelly. But if you can read this quote in early modern English, this is one of the angels speaking to Dee and Kelly. Every letter signifieth the member of the substance whereof it speaketh. I don't know what stronger statement of realism you could possibly get than that. Every letter, not every word, but every letter signifies the member of the substance. That is to say, the category, all right, whereof it speaks. It's a statement by an angel saying that this language, and perhaps uniquely this language, is of radical metaphysical import. Radical metaphysical import. It is not just arbitrary. When I say the word dog in English or canis in Latin, and an angel says it in Enochian, it's not the same. This language, right? The letters they're separating confusion, but this language, right, is at some level the language that the creator spoke. It is then spoken in the center of the mind of the creator, where even as the mind of man is moved at ordered speech. The argument here, I think the angel's making, and it's a bit confusing, but I think the argument that the angel's making here is that not only is this language important in the sense that this is a language that God spoke being into being with, but it maintains that power in a way that perhaps Hebrew has lost, or Hebrew is a degenerated form thereof. So even in the Enochian turn, this concern about metaphysics and semiotics, metaphysics and language, categories and language, it persists even in the voice and even in the speech of the angels. And as folks know, right, the language itself was meant to be the vehicle by which there is a profound apocalyptic reform of all of Christendom, a reform of all language, a reform of all science. And this would be the language that laid at the origins of creation. It was a language that God spoke being into, but also it was going to be the mechanism by which God was going to roll up the carpet and bring the whole thing to a close. The language was the mechanism of creation, but just as importantly, the language was the mechanism of the apocalypse. It was going to be the conduit by which God was going to turn the lights off in just the same way that God turned the lights on to begin with. Just a last couple of things as we wrap up. So the Hermeticists won, right? The neo-realists won. No, they didn't win. Of course, they didn't win. In fact, the scholastic nominalists and the what I might call the occult realists, they all lost. Who did they lose to? The rationalists. The rationalists came on the scene, right? And the entire conversation changed. Nominalism was defeated at some level by rationalism and empiricism. And at some level, rationalism and empiricism also dealt a death blow to Hermeticism. Casaubon dated the Corpus Hermeticum to much later than everyone thought it was. And in some sense, the conversation went a different direction. Neither nominalism, aside from Thomists, as always, there was Thomists over there somewhere doing their Thomist thing. At Notre Dame, there's a Thomist thinking about categories right now in some Scotian sense. But they're a tiny minority. They're a tiny academic minority within the Catholic world. Occultist realists are also a tiny minority in the world of philosophy. I would say even a smaller minority than the Thomists are. In some sense, empiricism and rationalism would carry the conversation in a totally different direction. However, and this is where I'll end, realism has kind of weirdly hung on. In a anonymous poll taken in 2020 among the Phil papers, this is a series of questions where philosophers are asked anonymously what they really believe. That's the only way to get on philosophers, to be honest. They'll never tell you what they really believe because they'll be lambasted for it. But secretly, they'll tell you, this is what I really believe. And they were asked, when you're asked a question of the ontology of abstract objects, like mathematicals or other kinds of abstract objects, where do you lean? Nominalism or Platonism? And you see, folks, on the screen, 39.3% of academic philosophers in the Anglophone world lean toward Platonism. That's the biggest plurality, 39%. Now, they're followed up really closely by 37% by the nominalists and the completely respectable philosophical position of other at 23%. I don't know what other is, but it's probably some moderated version of realism, frankly. Realism has, by a very slim amount, still there among the academics. Now, I don't know how many of them are occultists. My guess is probably very little. But what I want to point here is that we tell ourselves a story about how rationalism and empiricism won. Rationalism and empiricism didn't win. What won, at least according to the data we have now, is some form of realism. And that puts, weirdly enough, academics in philosophy closer to Renaissance Hermeticists, Cabalists, and Platonists than they probably think they are. And in a way, I think this represents the return of the repressed. Would they say, yeah, I'm on the same team as Ficino, Pico, and Agrippa? They would, no, definitely not. They would not admit to that. But under the hood, are they committed to some of the same kind of ideas? I would argue that despite themselves, in a very Freudian return of the repressed, they are. And in this way, realism in the form of Kabbalah, in the form of Platonism, in the form of Hermeticism, has indeed had a very strange shelf life, very strange half-life, of which we and them are strangely part of that radioactivity. Thank you, guys.